We're standing under Magnolia campbellii, which is almost 150 years old now, and it exemplifies one of the extraordinary features of many Asian plants that have been introduced to our gardens. That is something called precocious flowering, which means the flowers appear long before the leaves do. And it does mean that the spectacle of the flowers is therefore not hidden by the leaves, and it makes the tree all the more spectacular. Magnolias do have extraordinarily large blooms for a tree, and one of the intriguing things about this very archaic group of plants, this ancient lineage, is there are fossil magnolias from 95 million years ago, which look more or less the same as our modern magnolia trees. The other extraordinary feature is that 90 million years ago, we didn't have butterflies, moths, bees, and wasps. There were, in fact, very few orders of flying insects, and beetles were the most probable pollinators of those trees back in the Cretaceous era. And remarkably, we find to this day that beetles are still one of the most important pollinators of wild species of Magnolia. This particular specimen here is not campbellii itself, but a subspecies, Seamus, isn't it?
Yes, so it's essentially the eastern race of Magnolia campbellii. And of course, Matthew, we're standing beneath this great big mammoth tree of Magnolia campbellii, and it famously, it's taken the longest wait to see it in bloom. So some magnolias, it can take 10, 15, 20, 25 years to bloom. This one was planted against the wall in 1876. It first blossomed in 1907, 31 years later.
Wow, yes.
So the great thing about this is Magnolia campbellii, subspecies mollicumata, and if you sow the seed, it only takes 12 years to bring it into bloom. So this, of course, is just opening up, but it's very distinct. It's different to Magnolia campbellii in the structure of the flower, which is sort of very easy to spot on the tree because it forms a cup and saucer shape. So you get the outer tepals will flatten and the inner part of the flower stays upright. But you know, there's a famous story that goes with the introduction of this plant, and it was introduced in 1919 by the famous Scottish plant hunter George Forrest. And Forrest, of course, he kept collection numbers with individual plants. So the plant that he introduced was beneath the number Forrest 25655, and it's known as the Magnolia with the telephone number because, of course, that was a London telephone number at the time. And from Forrest 25655, they were raised in gardens like Cairhayes, at Warrington Park and at Board Hill, and they introduced the most fantastic colour forms of this particular Magnolia campbellii subspecies mollicumata. Bit of a mouthful, but a fantastic plant to grow.
I think one of the extraordinary things about campbellii and many of these species from the east, of course, is their seeds were not long-lived, and it did present quite a problem of introducing them to our gardens, did it not?
It did indeed, actually, and you know, for very often when the seed was travelling to the tropics, they desiccated. So certainly for this big old beast, we know that all of the earlier consignments, including this tree, they were sent from Darjeeling in Wardian cases, in sealed glass houses, sent down to the Calcutta Botanic Gardens, put on the decks of ships and sailed across to Europe. So that's a well-travelled tree overhead.
And another amazing thing about magnolias is about half the species are precocious flowers. They're deciduous, they lose their leaves in the winter, whereas the other half of Magnolia genus, they are evergreen. And I know we have a remarkable tree here which is, you know, as worthy of a story as the campbellii, which is Magnolia delavei.
Yeah, we've got a lovely old tree of Magnolia delavei. It's got great history behind it. It is associated with Glasnevin, and it's just down here behind the courtyard.
And one of the important things about Glasnevin is it was a very significant introduction of trees into Irish gardens. And many of the British gardens, Kew, the Royal Horticultural Society, shared material with Frederick Moore. And one of Frederick Moore's great sort of claims to fame is how many gardens he advised on in Ireland, and not only, you know, with practical advice, but sharing of plants. And Magnolia delavei, which we're standing under now, that was originally introduced to Glasnevin. And when it was no more than 5 or 6 years there, he propagated it and he brought this plant down and planted it here, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's apt that you're here today, Matthew, because, of course, Sir Frederick Moore was your predecessor. He was Ireland's greatest horticulturist at the time. And like you say, he was really keen to see newly introduced plants in gardens with better growing conditions on Glasnevin, or with more space for growing these plants. So Magnolia delavei, its history really sort of is encapsulated within the last 120, 130 years. It's named for the great French missionary, Père Jean-Marie Delavay, and he was climbing mountains north of Dali in Yunnan province in 1889. He collected specimens of what was then, of course, an unknown Magnolia species. He sent his collections back to Paris because, of course, he was not just a plant collector, he was a missionary. And his collections were described just 3 years later by the famous French taxonomist Adrien René Franche, and Franche named it after him, Magnolia delavei. And nothing more was heard about the Magnolia for about a decade until an obscure Irishman, Augustin Henry, who was based with the Customs Service in southern China in a place called Mengxi in Yunnan province. In 1896, he stumbled across a population of them growing in the hills above Mengxi, and he sent his collections back to Kew. And his collections at Kew greatly excited the Veitch nursery. So they sent out a young man, a young English plant hunter, 23-year-old Ernest Henry Wilson. And of course, Wilson became so good at his job, he became known as Chinese Wilson. So Augustin Henry, he was stationed in a place called Semeo at the time, but he was very keen to get Wilson to stop at Mengxi and collect the seeds of this Magnolia, which he did. His seed was sent back to Europe, and the very first flowering of that tree was under glass at Kew in 1908, and it was such an exciting time that the plant it was sent to Walter Hood Fitch, Kew's prolific botanical artist. He sketched it, and it was featured in Curtis's Botanical Magazine, one of the great florilegia of its time, and that really excited gardeners. And then if you sort of fast forward, of course, it was growing at Glasnevin while it was growing at Kew. Sir Frederick Moore was really eager to get this species out of Glasnevin into other gardens, so he had it propagated. And one of the other gardens that he advised in was for the Walpoles at Mount Usher, which is just up the road. In 1918, he had a youngster sent to Mount Usher. It still grows there to this day. But a year later, a letter arrives here to Isabel Ball Acton, and it says that myself and Phyllis, so this is Lady Moore, will be down to plant the tree in April. So we know the tree was planted in April 1919 by Sir Frederick and Lady Moore. But what's nice to know about that and to remember about that is that it was within this garden that Sir Frederick Moore proposed to Lady Moore. And this it heralds and it reminds us of the 4 decades that he and Lady Moore advised here, and not just that, of course, his father David Moore before him advised here, and 80 years from one family of dedicated service to Kilmacurragh.
Absolutely. And one of the intriguing things about delavei is the flower, unlike many other magnolias, is very short-lived. I think it's only really 2 days it hangs. It hides really amongst the foliage, but I think you, more than anyone else, will know that after hours, something special happens with this tree.
Yeah, I'm really lucky. I live on the estate, of course, and I live in the courtyard just behind us here. So the flowers, of course, as you say, it's sort of evening opening, night scented. And once the visitors have left, the flowers open, and you get these powerful wafts of really strong, beautiful scent wafting into the courtyard in the evening.
And in China, I mean, these plants have been very significant in their cultivation. So for 14 or 15 centuries, the Chinese have been cultivating these plants, and delavei would have been attractive to them because of this extraordinary scent. I mean, it's a late spring flower, really early summer, isn't it, that it comes into its own. Significantly, these trees do feature in Chinese accounts of horticulture there, and the way they were cultivated was really part of their allure for the same reason that we love them here in European gardens.
Yeah, I mean, actually, China has a really ancient history of horticulture and planting trees. And one of the best places, of course, to see trees in China is by temples, whether they're Taoist temples or Buddhist temples. And if you visit Lijiang in northwest Yunnan and go to the Yufeng temple, there's the famous Magnolia delevei that was planted there over 4 centuries ago. And of course, that history goes back even further, because China's most famous magnolia is the Yulan, Magnolia denudata. At one point, the only person who was allowed to cultivate the Yulan was the Emperor of China himself, grown in the Forbidden City.
And that way, yes, the Yulan and the Mulan was the other species of magnolia often cultivated in China. And many people will be familiar with the story of Mulan, the female warrior. The Mulan, it has got the wonderful lily-like flowers, lily flora being its name.
Yeah, and of course, cross the two, and you get a fantastic hybrid that's planted throughout suburban gardens.
Well, exactly. We should always mention Magnolia soulangiana, this extraordinary tree, widespread not only in Irish and British gardens, but also in American gardens. Soulangiana is probably one of the most characteristic suburban trees. It's small, flowers magnificently with this wonderful precocious habit, so it has become, one of the most popular, and like you say, a hybrid between the Mulan and the Yulan.
And I think it celebrated its 200th anniversary not that long ago, because of course it was bred by a Napoleonic officer who famously said, "We shouldn't be fighting, we should be planting cabbages." And by cabbages he meant magnolias.
And and in consequence his name is commemorated in that very widespread hybrid.
Yeah, probably the best hybrid ever bred.
Yeah.